What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. As you can see behind me, we have a bunch of numbers on the board. With the release of the GT3 and GTD Mustang, it seems like there's a lot of misunderstandings about how leverage ratios of wings and wing mounts work. So in today's video, we're going to kind of use some math to answer that. Also, last thing to note, these lovely t-shirts designed by me are on the website. Link to those below. So very first thing we're going to do is jump into a screen grab of a GT3 GTD style wing kit I'm working on S550 Mustangs. Now, one thing I have to be extremely clear on is the amount of CFD. I keep looking over my shoulder because my GT350 is sitting over there. The amount of CFD we have on the S550 chassis. Developing a bunch of our wings, JKF Aero, former Mercedes F1 aerodynamicist who started his own Aero consulting company, did all of our CFD on our Apex line of wing profiles on the S550 Mustang. We're intimately familiar with it. And the one very interesting thing we found out about that is we got the best overall downforce numbers when a wing on that chassis was 2 inches below roof height. So that's a data point we know for sure. And again, all these numbers behind me, just remember that roof height on pretty much any modern car with a shallow rear glass will put the wing in clean air. Going any higher than that, the wing doesn't see better airflow or anything. An example of a bad one would be maybe like a WRX or an E36, like a 4-door, something with a steep back glass. Okay, you might want to go a little bit higher to get into clean air. But yeah, just keep that in mind. Roof height on a S550 Mustang, shoot, even new cars, Camaros, Corvettes, stuff like that. Roof height is all you need to get the wing in clean air. So now that I touched on that, let's jump to my computer real quick. We'll do a screen grab, and going over that screen grab, you'll kind of see where I got all of these measurements and numbers and everything from. So it'll kind of make all this make a little more sense. All right, guys, so here we are in my CAD program. As you can see, we have the car and our 3 wing locations. If we bring up the sketch as if we're working on it, you can see this wing location here is even with the roof and even with the rear bumper. This one is set back 10 inches, as you can see here, and then this wing location is 10 inches higher than the roof, but still even with the rear bumper. So these are the 3 locations we're going to go over. As far as all the measurements, so this car is obviously to scale. If I get rid of it, so here's our wheelbase. Mustangs have 107.1 inch wheelbase. The main thing we need are our lever arms, which are these ones. So for example, the high mount one, I think in the video I used 66.6. I round to like 1 or 2 decimals. And then the other important note is this angle right here. Now, the one thing I think a lot of people don't understand is that wings don't just push, let's go to this one because we have the lines drawn. They don't just push straight down, which would be this line from the wing. Real quick caveat, you can see that the lines are going to the trailing edge of the wing. In the real world, the center of pressure of a wing is around the front third line of the mark, so it'd probably be like right about here. But for measuring purposes, it was easy to snap a line just to the trailing edge of the wing, and as you can see, that's the same on all the wings. Now, again, as I mentioned, if we bring the car back in, even this wing is getting perfectly clean air to it, so the force vectors that we're going to use on all these wings are the same. Now if I get rid of the car again, this angle on all of them is the important angle. Right here is the other one, and the third one right here. Already touched on lever arms and the force vector. So what I was mentioning is the downforce a wing makes, the downforce vector would be this one, straight down. The drag vector would be straight backwards. A wing always makes both of them at some angle, and that is the wing's force vector, and that would be this angle here. Now, I'm kind of just using a rough number for examples of this video. A wing that makes more drag would obviously, obviously not good, but the force vector would be more backwards, and that would change this angle, and it would change all the math and everything. But again, we're using the same wing for this example, just in 3 different mount locations. So now that we have all of our lever arms and angles, we could jump to where we get our equations from. All right, so here's a cool diagram of some of the equations we're going to need right from the NASA website. Example 3 is one that we're going to use for most of them. As you see in the clips, I use R for radius arm, but as long as it's noted and you know what it is. The angle right here, take note of this. This is cosine of this angle, which would be sine of this angle right here. So in the video, you'll see me use this angle, and I got one more diagram we'll go over. But torque at point P right here equals force times L times the cosine of this angle. So that's one equation we'll use a lot. And again, like I mentioned, the next one you'll see, instead of cosine of angle, we'll use sine of a separate angle. Math all works out the same. And then to work the math backwards, once we have the torque at point P, our wheelbase on the car would be L, and we can solve for F to figure out how much lift we're getting on the front axle. So keep in mind this example A right here, and this is example 3. All right, guys, so here's the one I was just mentioning. Torque equals R, so the radius of your lever arm, which in our example is going from the rear axle of the car up to the wing. Now, something I don't think I mentioned yet is regardless of how this radius arm or lever arm is shaped, the math works out the same. So let's say from this point you had some arm that arced up and around and down, and then finally back to this point. It still just acts in a straight line. So whenever people mention the wing uprights mounting to a part of the car making downforce at that point, that's just wrong. The force happens at the front axle and rear axle, and where the wing is positioned in relation to the two. So this one, as you'll see, our radius arm comes up, so the wing would be at this point where we apply our force. Our force would obviously be happening in the opposite direction, but you can see how this equation uses the sine of this angle. Basic algebra or geometry, this dotted black line and this solid black line, this angle right here is the same as this angle. So in the video, you'll see me use this angle. It's all the same. And then from there, we could just do the math to figure out the torque on the rear axle. And then you'll see us do, the front axle would go off this way, and use that example 1 formula to calculate the lift on the front axle of all of our wing mount locations. All right, so now that you have seen where I got all my measurements and angles and everything from, we get to do the fun stuff, the math. So what we're gonna have is our front axle, 107-inch wheelbase, and basically our lever arm going up to the wing up here. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the force vector of a wing is not straight down. It's down and back at a little bit of an angle, right? So obviously this is not to scale. But in our roof height and even with bumper scenario, that makes the lever arm, oops, it's terrible writing. That makes the lever arm 59.4 inches. And this angle is 57.36. And again, like I mentioned earlier, we're basically going to see a torque right here. So the equation we're looking for is the torque on the rear axle from this being pushed this way. That should make sense. And we'll see a lift on the front. We'll get into that in a second. if we're just going to use 500 pounds, pushing down at this angle. So torque equals the R, which is your lever arm, and your sine of your angle, which is this 57.36. So the torque, here I'll label them. Torque, this is force parallel, or I'm sorry, perpendicular. We'll get into that in a second. So our 59.4 inches times force, oops. We're going to backtrack just a second. I forgot the force vector times the sine of your angle. So 500 pounds times the sine of 57.36 is 0.842. So 500 times 0.842 times 59.4 gives us a torque of 25,007 pounds. Because remember, we're in inches and pounds. So inch pounds, the easy math on that is 2,084 pound-feet. So sounds like a lot, but the math is what it is, and 500 pounds force is quite a bit. So anyways, so we're seeing a torque force right here of, we'll call it 25,000 inch-pounds. So now if we want to work this backwards to see how much lift that's making on the front, we can do our torque. So we know that's 25,000 equals our R is our lever arm on this one, so it's 107 times force parallel, which is what we're trying to find, which is this one. So basic math at this point, you divide 25,000 by 107 is 233 pounds. So we're seeing an upward force of 233 pounds on the front axle with the wing in this location and all of these weights. And having been in the wind tunnel enough, it's like this math is close enough. Seeing 200 and some pounds of lift, if you're making 500 pounds hanging off the rear axle, it's about in the ballpark. So now, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people will mount a wing much higher than necessary. Or, you know, if the rules allow it to be higher, it doesn't mean you have to go higher. I hope that makes sense. And as we do the math for the 10-inch above roof line, you know, hopefully you'll kind of see why. So here's our diagram for the 10-inch above roof line. 66.6 inch lever arm. Here's our torque that we're trying to find. Force tangent. We want the sine of, so we're going to use 500 pounds again. Coming back at a force vector. Again, remember, wings have down force, which is straight down, and then the drag force, which give you your force vector. So the force vector on this one is 51 degrees here. So if we go back to our formula, force sine of your angle. So torque equals the 66.6 times 500 times the sine of 51 is 0.777. All this math works out to 25,874 inch-pounds of force acting on the rear axle right here. Just like we did up here, if we do our math backwards, you can already tell we're going to see a higher lift on the front. Again, probably the biggest downside to mounting a wing higher than necessary is you're not necessarily multiplying the downforce force because you still have the same distance here, but going up, we'll jump up to the roof height one, 10 inches above, you can see how you're just multiplying the drag force at that point. So our torque is 25,874 inch-pounds. Equals our 107, which is R in this formula. That's R. Force perpendicular. All this math worked backwards is, so our force perpendicular equals 240, almost 242 pounds. So we're seeing 242 pounds of lift on this situation. So you can see by just raising the wing 10 inches, everything else being even, you're seeing an extra 9 pounds of lift by the time you get to the front axle. Alright, so situation 3 is the wing is going to be 10 inches behind the rear bumper, but at roof height. So again, our diagram, here's the front axle, wheelbase, lever arm up to our force of 500 pounds. This angle is 63.1 degrees. Lever arm, 67.1. So again, our torque, you know what, I'll do this one down here. So torque is at the rear axle, force perpendicular. This is our force vector. Torque equals, let's see, 67.1 times 500 times the sine of 63.1 is 0.892. Oops. So all this math worked out. Torque equals 29,926. So from what we just went over in this one, you can probably already tell we're going to see more lifting on the front. Again, all things being even. If we work it backwards, let's see, 29,926 equals 107 force parallel. All this math worked out comes up to, so force tangent is 279 pounds. So we're seeing 279 pounds lifted on the front. Now, that's obviously a lot more than the 242 down here. So you might be wondering, well then, what's the point of setting your wing back so far? Now what we're going to do is we're going to work the math backwards yet again, where we're going to solve for force on the wing. So we're a 10-inch setback, and we're going to be trimmed out. So the diagram in this one is the same. We got our 107 wheelbase. Lever arm is still 67.1. But we're going to solve for force X. So we'll say 63.1 degrees. So in order to get this far, we first have to do force tangent, and let's say we want to match our first one. So let's say we only want we can live with 233 pounds of lift on the front. So if we end up working this equation backwards, let's write our torque equals R, force perpendicular, times sine of your angle. So if we work this backwards to find the torque, we need torque equals, let's see, our lever arm times force at the front tire, which is, what did we say, 233. So to find the torque right here, there's no angles involved because it's just straight. Here's our lever arm. So the torque equals 107 times 233, which is 24,931. And you can already see how that 24,000, I hope that's readable. So our 24,931 inch-pounds, because this is inches, this is pounds, of torque is actually very close to our 25,000 way up in situation 1. Now the main difference is if we want our downforce lever arm, this measurement right here is 50.8. While up here, this is 40.8, so you can kind of already see you got a longer lever arm behind the rear axle. Now what we want to do is solve for force X. Sorry, that should be that. So now that we know our torque is 24,931, our lever arm 67.1, we're looking for force X times the sine of the 63.1 is 0.892. This math worked backwards is 416.5 pounds equals force X. So setting the wing back 10 inches to end up with the same amount of weight on everything, you then only need the wing to make 416 pounds. Now, obviously assuming you're going to have the same wing on the car, that should tell you all you have to do is, trim the wing out. Take a couple degrees of wing angle out of it. You're making less drag at that point, and obviously less drag is always better. So there you go, going over some math of those 3 separate wing mounting locations. Now the math is kind of neat how it all works out, but a few things that you can account for in this math, something like the 10-inch above roof. It's very well documented in CFD studies how a wing will help a diffuser or just even underbody extraction. So the higher you go with a wing, you're diminishing that interaction, right? So especially if it's a diffuser car, you might see less rear total downforce. Even a non-diffuser, non-flat floor car, a wing will help. The way it shapes the low pressure behind a car, it will help extract air out from under the car. So in that case, a lower wing is a positive. Now another downside to the 10-inch above roof, you're now adding you're moving that mass of the wing that much higher. So when the car is in a roll condition, it has to, it has to be able to handle that much more weight, because at that point the lever arm of the weight is much higher, and it's just a little more weight for the car to handle under roll conditions. The mounts will be longer, so they'll probably be a little bit heavier as well. Both minor, but still negatives. Now, negative to wing setback, you add some weight, further back off the end of the car, physical weight, which will add a little bit to the polar moment of inertia, having that wing that far back. But you keep the interaction, or it could even get better with the underbody flow, and diffuser extraction as well. So if I had to pick between any of these, I would probably do wing setback, just because of the main fact that you get to trim the wing out and lose all that drag. But again, most people, you're racing in some class that has rules you got to adhere to. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully this kind of clears up a couple things for you guys. Because like I mentioned, with the GTD and GT3 Mustang, it just seems like people are going crazy with wing mount stuff. Oh, and one quick thing I need to add on the 10-inch setback situation. 10 inches is quite a bit. You can get in a situation where your aero gain on the rear due to, so your 10-inch setback, you have a long lever arm here. And let's say you have a short nosed car, and let's say this is only like a 24-inch lever to your splitter. As you go faster, the aero gain in the rear will be more than the Aero gain in the front. So when you're going slower, the car might feel balanced because the Aero at that point isn't making as much of a total downforce number. But as you go faster, you can end up in a situation where the car will actually become more unstable the faster you go due to the imbalance of the rear gaining more than the front as speed increases. So I hope that makes sense as well.